Is this some kind of joke? The voice cut through the stifling heat of the engine room like a blade. Lieutenant Commander Blake stood rigid, his pristine uniform already darkening with sweat, glaring at the figure near the massive turbine. An old man, 70, maybe older. Dark blue overalls smeared with decades of grease. Weathered hands that looked like they'd built ships with bare knuckles. Robert Sullivan didn't respond. He simply ran his palm along a thick conduit, the touch almost loving. Around them, a dozen engineers stood frozen, their million-dollar diagnostics useless. The USS Vigilance had been dead for 48 hours. A 5,000-soul floating city, paralyzed. Blake's jaw tightened. "Who the hell are you and what are you doing in my engine room?" Still, the old man said nothing. He pulled something from his pocket, a battered stethoscope, metal bell tarnished beyond recognition. A few engineers smirked. Blake's face flushed crimson. "Security! Remove this man!" But then Sullivan placed the bell against an auxiliary valve, closed his eyes, and listened to something nobody else could hear. "Before we continue, if you believe experience and wisdom should be honored, type respect below. And tell me where you're watching from. This story of Robert Sullivan proves that true expertise speaks louder than credentials. I read every comment." The Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, its surface deceptively calm under the afternoon sun. But beneath that tranquility, the USS Vigilance drifted like a wounded whale. 300 meters of American naval power, home to F-18 Super Hornets and 5,000 sailors, reduced to emergency diesel generators and prayer. In the bowels of the carrier, the main engine room resembled a cathedral of failure. Pipes thick as tree trunks snaked in every direction. Control panels blinked uselessly. The air tasted of metal and desperation. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Blake had been awake for 36 of the last 48 hours. His eyes were red-rimmed, his movements sharp with caffeine and frustration. He was 34 years old, a prodigy who'd graduated top of his class at Annapolis with advanced degrees in nuclear engineering and fluid dynamics. He understood these systems better than anyone on board, except the engines wouldn't start. Elite teams had been helicoptered in from Pearl Harbor. Diagnostics had been run until the computers threatened to overheat. Every procedure in the manual had been followed twice. Nothing. The ship remained dead in the water, a sitting duck in international waters. Blake felt the weight of 5,000 lives pressing down on his shoulders. His career hung by a thread. And now this. "He's with me." The voice from the hatchway belonged to Rear Admiral Pike, a man whose weathered face told stories of 4 decades at sea. He stepped into the engine room, his expression grim. Behind him stood the old man in overalls, moving with a quiet confidence that didn't match his appearance. Blake straightened to attention, but his resentment was palpable. "Admiral, with all due respect, this is a restricted area. We're dealing with a nuclear-powered vessel. We have the best engineers in the fleet working on it." "The best engineers in the fleet," Pike replied, his voice dangerously soft, "have had 2 days. The ship is still a barge." He gestured toward Sullivan. "Master Chief Sullivan is here at my request." "Master Chief?" The title tasted like ashes in Blake's mouth. An enlisted man. "Admiral, his service records must be decades old. We're dealing with integrated digital control systems, not steam gauges. And yet your digital systems aren't working," Pike shot back. The rebuke hung in the air like gun smoke. Several junior officers suddenly found their consoles fascinating. Blake's face flushed deep red. He glanced at the old man, who still hadn't acknowledged him. Sullivan was studying the machinery with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. His gaze swept across the labyrinth of pipes and conduits, not like a technician checking a schematic, but like an artist examining a masterpiece he'd once created. What nobody in that room knew yet was that Robert Sullivan hadn't just worked on these engines. He'd helped design them. 30 years ago, when the prototypes kept failing on the test stands, when the Navy's brightest minds were ready to scrap the entire propulsion system, they'd called in a grizzled Master Chief with grease under his fingernails and fire in his eyes. Sullivan had spent 3 months living in the prototype facility, sleeping 4 hours a night, until he'd found the flaw nobody else could see. But that was ancient history, filed away in classified reports that these young engineers had never read. Sullivan moved deeper into the engine room, his boots silent on the deck plates. He ran his hand along a coolant pipe, feeling the temperature through his palm. He paused at a junction box, tilting his head as if listening to whispers. The junior engineers exchanged glances. Some smirked. Others looked uncomfortable. Blake folded his arms across his chest, his jaw tight. "Admiral, I must insist that proper protocols be followed." "We cannot have unauthorized personnel—" "Master Chief Sullivan," Pike interrupted, his voice sharp as a razor, "holds security clearances higher than yours, Commander. He wrote half the emergency procedures you've been failing to execute. Now let the man work." The tension in the engine room thickened like humidity before a storm. Blake stood his ground, his authority challenged in front of his entire team. He'd spent years climbing the ranks, proving himself in simulations and classrooms, earning the respect of his peers through test scores and technical papers. And now an old man in coveralls was making him look incompetent. "I need to see his credentials," Blake insisted, his voice tight. "I need proper authorization forms. You need to step aside." Admiral Pike's patience had evaporated. "That's an order, Commander." From her position at a secondary console, Petty Officer Sarah Martinez watched the confrontation with growing unease. She was 26, a talented engineer who'd joined the Navy to escape a dead-end town in New Mexico. She'd learned quickly that the Navy ran on two things: protocol and pride. Blake had both in abundance, but she'd also learned to read situations, and this one was spiraling toward disaster. She'd heard whispers about the old man. One of the helicopter pilots had mentioned a name in passing: the engine whisperer. She'd thought it was a joke, but now, watching Sullivan move through the machinery with that strange reverence, she wasn't so sure. Sullivan stopped at a bank of auxiliary systems tucked behind the main turbine assembly. These were backup systems, older designs that the modern Navy considered redundant. The digital diagnostics barely monitored them anymore. He crouched down, his knees cracking with age, and examined a valve assembly no bigger than a coffee can. Lieutenant Chen, one of Blake's most loyal officers, couldn't resist. "Sir, those auxiliary valves are non-critical. Our diagnostics show them functioning within normal parameters. There's no way they're causing a catastrophic shutdown." Sullivan didn't respond. He pulled out his stethoscope, that ancient, battered tool that looked like it belonged in a museum. The metal bell was scratched and tarnished. The rubber tubing had been repaired with electrical tape in 3 places. He placed it against the valve housing and closed his eyes. The engine room fell silent except for the low hum of emergency generators. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Blake shifted his weight, about to speak, when Sullivan's expression changed. His eyes remained closed, but his brow furrowed. His weathered hand tightened on the stethoscope. A memory crashed through him like a rogue wave. The North Atlantic, 1987. USS Kensington, a guided missile destroyer caught in a storm that the meteorologists hadn't predicted. Waves 40 feet high, the ship rolling 35 degrees, and in the engine room, a sound. A tiny, insidious vibration that nobody else could hear over the roar of the storm and the screaming of stressed metal. Sullivan had used this same stethoscope, pressed it against a steam line that every gauge said was functioning perfectly. But he'd heard it. A hairline fracture, invisible to the eye, inaudible to anyone not listening with decades of experience. He'd ordered an emergency shutdown over the protests of the chief engineer. 70 seconds later, the line had ruptured exactly where he'd predicted. If the steam had been flowing at full pressure, it would have killed everyone in the compartment. They'd called him crazy, right up until they'd seen the crack. Back in the present, Sullivan opened his eyes. He looked at the valve assembly with an expression that Blake couldn't quite read. Sadness, maybe, or recognition, like meeting an old friend who'd fallen on hard times. "This valve isn't closing completely," Sullivan said quietly. His voice was gravelly, rough from disuse. "There's a harmonic resonance. Microscopic steam bypass into the secondary coolant line." Lieutenant Chen glanced at his diagnostic tablet. Impossible. The pressure readings show. Your pressure readings, Sullivan interrupted gently, are looking at the wrong place. The bypass is too small to register on the main gauges, but it's throwing off the turbine's balance by 0.03%. The computer sees the imbalance, thinks the turbine shaft is failing, and triggers an automatic shutdown to prevent catastrophic damage. Blake's face was unreadable. That's not in any failure mode we've studied. No, Sullivan agreed. It wouldn't be. This failure mode only happens when 3 specific conditions align: extended high-speed operation in warm water, a valve seat that's worn in a particular pattern, and a resonant frequency that matches the turbine's natural harmonics. I've seen it exactly once before, 32 years ago. The junior engineers stared at him. Martinez felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. This wasn't guesswork. This was something else entirely. Blake's hand moved toward his radio. Martinez knew what was coming. He was going to call security again, have Sullivan removed by force if necessary. The situation was about to explode. She made a decision. Her fingers flew across her console, typing an encrypted message to a contact she'd served under years ago, now working as an aide to the Fleet Admiral. The message was brief and direct. Civilian consultant Sullivan being obstructed by Chief Engineer Blake. USS Vigilance. Situation critical. Crew losing confidence. She hit send and prayed she hadn't just ended her own career. 3,000 miles away in a climate-controlled command center at Naval Base San Diego, Fleet Admiral David Cortez was in the middle of a video conference with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. At 62, Cortez was a man who'd seen combat in 3 different theaters and commanded 2 carrier battle groups. His reputation was built on decisiveness and an almost supernatural ability to read situations. His aide approached silently and placed a tablet on the desk. Cortez glanced down. His eyes narrowed as he read the name, Robert Sullivan. A flicker of something, surprise, recognition, perhaps even concern, crossed his weathered face. He held up a hand. On the main screen, a 3-star general stopped mid-sentence. The other Joint Chiefs waited. Such an interruption from Cortez was unprecedented. "Gentlemen," Cortez said, his voice calm but edged with steel, "I have an urgent operational matter. We'll reconvene at 1600. He ended the conference before anyone could respond. He turned to his aide. "Get me Admiral Pike on the Vigilance. Secure channel. And get me a direct line to the Secretary of the Navy's office. Inform them I'm initiating a personal command intervention." The aide's eyes widened. A personal command intervention was a tool of last resort, something that stripped away layers of command and put the Fleet Admiral in direct operational control. It was almost never used. "Sir, the situation on the Vigilance involves Master Chief Robert Sullivan." Cortez cut him off. "Do you know who that is?" The aide shook his head. Cortez stood, his powerful frame casting a long shadow. "He's the man who saved my ship 20 years ago. He's the reason I'm standing here instead of at the bottom of the Arabian Sea. Now make those calls." Back on the USS Vigilance, Sullivan was giving quiet instructions to the engineering team. His voice was calm, almost gentle, as he explained exactly what needed to be done. He wasn't barking orders like Blake. He was teaching. "The valve seat needs to be manually reset," Sullivan explained, pointing to the assembly. "A quarter turn clockwise, not a half turn. That'll over-tighten it and you'll crack the housing. The digital controls can't make this adjustment because they're designed to protect the valve from human error. But sometimes human error is exactly what you need." Petty Officer Martinez stepped forward. "I'll do it, Master Chief." Sullivan nodded and handed her a heavy wrench. "Slow and steady. You'll feel it catch at the right position. Trust your hands, not the computer." As Martinez worked, sweat beading on her forehead, Blake stood frozen. He was watching his entire worldview crumble. Everything he'd learned, every simulation he'd mastered, every theory he'd studied, none of it had prepared him for this. The old man was solving a problem that shouldn't exist using methods that shouldn't work. "Got it," Martinez said, feeling the valve catch exactly where Sullivan had predicted. "Quarter turn. Seated perfectly." Sullivan smiled. Good. Now we need to override the automatic shutdown sequence. It's going to fight us because it thinks it's protecting the turbine. We need to manually bypass the safety protocols for approximately 90 seconds while the system recalibrates. That's against regulations, Lieutenant Chen said automatically. Yes, it is, Sullivan agreed. But regulations are written for standard failures. This isn't standard. He looked directly at Blake for the first time. Commander, this is your ship, your call. But if we don't try this in the next 10 minutes, the backup diesel generators are going to start showing fatigue stress. And then you'll have a real emergency. Blake's jaw worked. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to maintain control, to follow the book. But 5,000 sailors were depending on him, his pride or their safety. The choice should have been simple. Before he could respond, the engine room's communication system crackled to life. The voice that boomed through the space made every single person freeze. This is Fleet Admiral Cortez. Who is in command of that engine room? Blake felt his knees go weak. The highest-ranking officer in the entire fleet. On the line. Now. Admiral Pike stepped forward. Admiral Cortez, this is Rear Admiral Pike, sir. Pike. The voice acknowledged. Report. Why is Master Chief Sullivan being obstructed? The use of Sullivan's rank and name sent shockwaves through the room. The Fleet Admiral knew him, personally. Blake felt the world tilting beneath his feet. We have a difference of opinion on procedure, Admiral, Pike said carefully. I see. 2 words, cold as ice. Lieutenant Commander Blake. Blake swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Is it true you've failed to restart the main engines for 48 hours? Sir, we've encountered unforeseen technical... Is it also true, the Fleet Admiral's voice cut across him like a laser, that you've dismissed the counsel of the most experienced propulsion specialist in the United States Navy? The man who wrote the failure analysis protocols you've been fumbling with? Stunned silence. The engineers stared at Sullivan with new eyes. This quiet old man wasn't just experienced. He was a legend they'd never heard of. Sir, I wasn't aware of... Blake stammered. That's precisely the problem, Commander. You weren't aware. You were arrogant. The Fleet Admiral's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. You let your faith in computer screens blind you to wisdom standing right in front of you. You are hereby relieved of your duties as Chief Engineer. Report to your quarters immediately and await further orders. The communication line went dead. The silence that followed was absolute. Blake stood paralyzed, his face ashen. In the span of 90 seconds, his career had been destroyed. Without another word, he turned and walked stiffly toward the hatch, his shoulders hunched, his world in ruins. As the hatch clanged shut behind him, Admiral Pike turned to the assembled crew. Master Chief Sullivan has operational command of this engine restart. You will give him whatever he requires. Is that understood? A chorus of, "Yes, sir," echoed through the compartment. Sullivan simply nodded and turned back to the machinery. All right, let's bring her home. As the crew began following his instructions with new urgency and respect, Martinez found herself standing next to the old man as he studied a diagnostic panel. Master Chief, she said quietly, that thing the Fleet Admiral said about you writing the protocols, is that true? Sullivan glanced at her, a hint of warmth in his weathered eyes. Long time ago. Different Navy. But machines don't change as much as people think they do. How did you know what was wrong? The diagnostics showed nothing. He picked up his battered stethoscope, holding it up to the light. This tool is older than you are, older than most of the equipment on this ship. You know why I still use it? Martinez shook her head. Because it forces you to be quiet, forces you to listen instead of looking at screens. The machine talks to you if you know how to hear it. He placed the stethoscope in her hands. Your generation trusts computers too much. Computers are smart, but they're not wise. They can't feel a vibration that's 0.03% off normal. They can't hear a harmonic that shouldn't be there. They can't remember the last time they heard that exact same sound 30 years ago during a storm that nearly killed everyone in the engine room. She stared at the worn tool in her hands. You've been doing this a long time. 46 years, enlisted at 18. I was a machinist's mate, third class on a destroyer that was older than God. Chief engineer was a man named Wolcott, mean as a snake, twice as smart. He taught me that every machine has a soul. Not literally, but there's a rhythm to it, a personality. When something's wrong, the whole machine knows it. You just have to learn its language. Martinez looked at the massive turbine assembly. And you speak this one's language. I helped raise it, Sullivan said simply. When they were building the first Nimitz-class carriers, the propulsion systems kept failing during tests. The manufacturers were ready to scrap the whole design. The Navy brought in every expert they could find. I was just a Master Chief, but Admiral Rickover himself asked me to take a look. Spent 3 months in that facility. Barely slept. But I found the problem. Design flaw in the valve timing sequence. They fixed it, and these engines have been the most reliable in the fleet ever since. He paused, his expression distant. That was 1989. I retired in 92. Figured the Navy didn't need an old wrench turner anymore. Got a little house in Maine, fixed fishing boats. Thought I was done. What changed? Admiral Pike called 3 days ago, said the Vigilance was in trouble, said they'd tried everything. He asked if I'd be willing to consult. Sullivan's voice dropped. You don't say no when your country calls, even if you're 70 years old and haven't touched a naval engine in 30 years. Above them, the sound of rotor blades announced the arrival of helicopters. But these weren't bringing more engineers or equipment. They were bringing something else entirely. The helicopters that landed on the USS Vigilance's flight deck carried an unusual cargo. A 2-star admiral, a full honor guard of Marines in dress blues, and a Navy public affairs team. They didn't head to the bridge. They went directly to the engine room. As Sullivan worked with Martinez and the engineering team, carefully executing the manual valve reset and preparing for the restart sequence, the hatch opened. The 2-star admiral entered, flanked by 6 Marines standing at rigid attention. Every sailor in the engine room immediately straightened. Admiral Pike stepped forward. Admiral Richardson, this is unexpected. On the contrary, Richardson replied, his voice carrying to every corner of the compartment. This is exactly what Fleet Admiral Cortez ordered. I'm here to correct an injustice. He walked directly to Sullivan, who was wiping his hands on a rag, completely unfazed by the sudden arrival of high-ranking brass. Richardson came to attention and delivered a crisp salute. Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Sullivan. On behalf of the United States Navy and by direct order of Fleet Admiral Cortez, I am here to formally recognize you. Sullivan returned the salute, his movement still precise despite his age. Richardson pulled out a formal citation and began to read, his voice clear and powerful. Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Sullivan, United States Navy, retired. Recipient of the Navy Cross for actions aboard the USS Kensington in 1987, where your identification of a critical steam line failure prevented a catastrophic loss of life and vessel. Recipient of 2 Navy and Marine Corps medals for developing propulsion system diagnostic procedures still in use fleet-wide today. Lead technical consultant on the Nimitz-class carrier propulsion design team from 1986 to 1991, responsible for solving critical reliability issues that had threatened the entire program. The junior engineers listened in stunned silence. Martinez felt tears prick her eyes. This man, this quiet, elderly man in greasy overalls, was a living legend. Richardson continued. Master Chief Sullivan's contributions to naval engineering are immeasurable. His expertise has been credited with saving an estimated 247 lives over the course of his career. His diagnostic methods, though often considered unconventional, have proven accurate in 100% of documented cases. He lowered the citation and looked directly at the assembled crew. Let this be a lesson to all of you. Rank and credentials do not equal wisdom. Technology is a tool, not a replacement for experience and instinct. Today, a junior officer dismissed a hero because he couldn't see past his own arrogance. That officer's career is over, but more importantly, he forgot the first rule of naval service. Respect those who came before you. Learn from them, because one day you'll be the ones with gray hair and young officers questioning your methods. He turned back to Sullivan. Fleet Admiral Cortez sends his personal regards and his deepest apologies for the disrespect you were shown. He wanted me to tell you that he still thinks about the Arabian Sea, that he owes you his life, and that the Navy owes you far more than a medal." Sullivan's expression remained calm, but Martinez saw something flicker in his eyes. Emotion, carefully controlled. "The ship needed help," he said simply. "That's all that matters." "Nevertheless," Richardson said, "your service is recognized, your expertise is valued, and your dignity is restored." The Marines came to attention, delivering a synchronized salute. Every sailor in the engine room followed suit, including Admiral Pike. Sullivan stood there, an old man in coveralls surrounded by the full ceremonial respect of the United States Navy, and simply nodded. "Thank you. Now, if you'll excuse me, we have an engine to start." Sullivan turned back to the control panel where Martinez waited, her hands trembling slightly over the console. The room remained at attention until Sullivan waved them at ease with a gentle gesture. "All right, folks. Ceremony's done. Let's finish the job." Admiral Richardson and his honor guard stepped back, but remained in the compartment to witness. Pike moved to stand beside Sullivan, and for the first time in 48 hours, there was a sense of genuine hope in the stifling air. "Petty Officer Martinez," Sullivan said quietly, "initiate the startup sequence. Slow and steady. Watch the turbine balance indicators. If you see any fluctuation over 0.1%, abort immediately. But I don't think you will." Martinez took a deep breath. Her finger hovered over the touchscreen. She'd started these engines 100 times during normal operations, but this felt different. This felt like history. She looked at Sullivan, who gave her an encouraging nod. She began the sequence. For 5 long seconds, nothing happened. The control panel remained dark. The massive turbine assembly sat silent. Then a low hum began to build from deep within the machinery. It was so faint at first that Martinez thought she might be imagining it, but it grew steadily, a sound that resonated through the deck plates and into her bones. The lights in the engine room flickered once, then burned with steady intensity as the main generators came online. On the control panel, diagnostic icons that had been stubbornly red for 2 days began to blink amber, then shifted one by one to green. The hum became a roar, the deep, powerful voice of the turbine spinning up to operational speed. It was a sound that every sailor on the USS Vigilance had been desperately waiting to hear. A sound that meant life returning to a dead ship. Cheers erupted from the assembled engineers. Martinez felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the readouts stabilize perfectly within normal parameters. The balance indicator showed 99, 97%, well within tolerance. Sullivan had been right. He'd been exactly right. Above them, throughout the entire ship, the news spread like wildfire. The engines were running. 5,000 sailors felt the subtle change in the deck's vibration as the massive propellers began to turn. The USS Vigilance was no longer drifting. She was a warship again. In the engine room, Admiral Richardson stepped forward and shook Sullivan's hand firmly. "Master Chief, on behalf of everyone aboard this vessel, thank you." Sullivan smiled slightly. "Just doing what I was trained to do, sir." Chief Wolcott would have figured it out faster. "Chief Wolcott," Pike said, "isn't here. You are, and you saved this ship." As the celebration continued around them, Sullivan caught Martinez's eye. He gestured for her to step aside with him. They moved to a quiet corner near the now humming machinery. "You sent that message to the Fleet Admiral's office," he said. It wasn't a question. Martinez's eyes widened. Yes, Master Chief, I thought—" "You thought right," Sullivan interrupted gently. "You saw a bad situation getting worse, and you took action. That took courage. Especially since Blake would have crucified you if it had gone differently." "I couldn't just watch it happen," Martinez said. "You knew what was wrong. Anyone with eyes could see that. But he was so determined to protect his pride," Sullivan finished. "I don't blame him. Not really. He's been taught that technology has all the answers, that newer is always better, that experience is just another word for obsolete." He pulled out his battered stethoscope again. "He'll learn. This experience will either destroy him or make him a better officer. That's up to him. He placed the stethoscope in Martinez's hands. I want you to have this. Master Chief, I can't. You can. You already know how to use it. You listened to the valve when I asked you to. You heard what I heard. That's a rare gift. Don't waste it by trusting computers more than your own ears. Martinez held the worn instrument like it was made of gold. I'll take care of it. I know you will. And 20 years from now, when some young hotshot with fancy degrees is telling you that the old ways don't work anymore, you pull that out and remember this day. Remember that wisdom isn't the same as knowledge. Remember that machines have souls, even if the manuals say they don't. The formal apology from the Navy was swift and public. A letter of reprimand was placed in Lieutenant Commander Blake's permanent record, effectively ending his career advancement. More significantly, a new training mandate was issued fleet-wide within a week. It was called the Sullivan Protocol, and it required all engineering officers to study historical case files where failures were solved by experience and intuition rather than digital diagnostics. 2 weeks later, on a quiet street in San Diego, a man in an unmarked running outfit was jogging at dawn. Marcus Blake had been reassigned to a desk job at a logistics center. His uniform now hung in a closet, a reminder of what he'd lost. As he rounded a corner, he saw an old man tending to a small garden. Robert Sullivan knelt among rose bushes, carefully pruning dead growth with the same gentle precision he'd used on the engine room valves. Blake stopped. His heart hammered in his chest. He'd been rehearsing this moment for days, but now that it was here, the words seemed inadequate. "Master Chief," he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. Sullivan looked up, his expression neutral. No malice, no triumph. He simply nodded. "Commander." Blake approached the fence. "I wanted to apologize. I was arrogant. I was wrong. What you did, it was incredible." Sullivan stood slowly, his knees protesting. He snipped a perfect white rose and offered it across the fence. "The most complicated machines are still just collections of simple parts. You just have to find the one that's out of tune." Blake took the rose, its thorns catching his thumb. A tiny drop of blood appeared. "I don't know if I can come back from this. Maybe you will. Maybe you won't," Sullivan said quietly. "But you learned something. That's all any of us can hope for. Next time someone with gray hair tries to teach you something, maybe you'll listen first and judge later." Blake nodded, the gesture filled with genuine humility. "Thank you, Master Chief." As he jogged away, Sullivan returned to his roses. The morning sun caught the dew on the petals, making them sparkle like tiny diamonds. Somewhere out in the Pacific, the USS Vigilance was slicing through the waves at full speed, her engines running perfectly. And in engine rooms across the fleet, young engineers were being taught to listen as carefully as they looked. To everyone who typed respect and shared where you're watching from, thank you for honoring those who served with quiet excellence. Subscribe for more stories of unsung American heroes like this. See you in the next one.